Hello and welcome. We're glad to have you all here and to have the opportunity to use today's workshop to help you better understand how you or your client can take full advantage of the benefits in the comprehensive and progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as the CPTPP. We also look forward to showcasing how you can use our CPTPP Guidebook for Vietnamese small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, to find answers to some of the questions you may encounter when exporting to or importing from another CPTPP country. The CPTPP offers many benefits to Vietnamese businesses, particularly SMEs, which we hope to showcase to you today. First, though, let me introduce our Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada team. My name's Pauline Stern. I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Foundation.
And my name is Olivia Adams, and I am a Research Analyst.
Hello, I'm Phoebe Ferrer, and I am also a Research Analyst.
And I'm Erin Williams, another Senior Program Manager at the Foundation. We're able to hold this workshop for you through funding by Global Affairs Canada via its Export Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development. This funding helps developing countries negotiate, implement, adapt to, and benefit from their trade and investment agreements with Canada.
Today's workshop will last approximately 1 hour, and by the end, we hope you come away with a deep excitement and understanding of how the CPTPP can benefit you. We will begin our workshop with an overview of what free trade agreements are and how they work, followed by a brief overview of the CPTPP and its benefits. Next, we'll give you a breakdown of how to use the guidebook and how it is organized. Then, we'll get more into the detail of the contents of the guidebook and the objectives of the most relevant chapters of the CPTPP in our how-to sections on trade in goods, trade in services, temporary entry, investment, government procurement, and other chapters. Finally, we'll provide you some case studies to apply what you've learned today and provide a brief overview of some of the other online resources that can be used in combination with the guidebook. Let's begin with an introduction from Erin on what free trade agreements are.
Thank you, Pauline. Let's start by defining a free trade agreement, also known as an FTA. It's a term we all use, but what does it really mean? Well, a free trade agreement is an agreement between two or more countries designed to reduce or eliminate trade barriers from labeling to food packaging, eliminate tariffs, essentially taxes, encourage investment, and create a clear set of rules for all parties to follow to make it easier for companies to operate between borders. A free trade agreement is an open concept, meaning that countries create their own sets of rules based on what works best for them and what benefits them the most. Engaging in free trade agreements helps Vietnam conduct more business. In fact, it's better to have an FTA than to not have an FTA. You get better standards and rules, you have fewer barriers, you have preferential treatment, meaning overall, you gain a competitive advantage. There are currently 17 FTAs that Vietnamese exporters can take advantage of. The CPTPP is the third largest free trade agreement that Vietnam is part of, after the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and the Vietnam-EU FTA. Vietnam, along with Singapore, Brunei, and Malaysia, is one of only 4 economies that are signatories to ASEAN, RCEP, and the CPTPP. Overall, FTAs benefit economies by providing opportunities for economic growth, job creation, and promoting regional economic integration. The CPTPP in particular is expected to benefit Vietnam's food, beverages and tobacco, clothing and leather, and textile sectors. Back to you, Phoebe, to share the highlights of the CPTPP.
Thank you, Erin. Now, looking at the CPTPP agreement, what exactly is the CPTPP and what makes it so great? The CPTPP is a free trade agreement between 11 countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, Peru, Singapore, New Zealand, and Vietnam. The CPTPP's main goals are to increase international trade and investment, provide economic growth, and promote regional economic integration. The agreement represents a significant share of the world's economies. Members of the CPTPP account for 15% of global gross domestic product, 15.4% of global trade, and 6.6% of the world's population. Once it's fully implemented, 99% of tariff lines will be entirely duty-free for all CPTPP parties. With this market access, the benefits to Vietnamese businesses are immense. The CPTPP is expected to increase Vietnam's GDP growth rate by 3.5%, create 20,000 to 26,000 jobs, and increase exports by 14.3%. The agreement provides important market access gains for Vietnamese exporters, especially in economies that Vietnam had not previously had a free trade agreement with, such as Canada, Mexico, and Peru. The CPTPP also offers additional benefits and opportunities for Vietnamese small and medium enterprises, which, according to the General Statistics Office of Vietnam, make up 97% of Vietnam's businesses. The CPTPP specifically addresses some of the barriers that currently disproportionately affect SMEs, such as administrative costs and customs barriers. Finally, the CPTPP makes sure that the benefits of the agreement are felt by all members of Vietnamese society. Back to you, Erin, for an overview of how to use this guidebook.
Thank you, Phoebe. Now that we have a general overview of the details of the CPTPP and an explanation of FTAs, let's take a look at the guidebook. The guidebook should be your primary resource for understanding the objectives of and rules within each CPTPP chapter. The CPTPP agreement itself is a large 30-chapter document, but we wanted to summarize the contents as best as possible. While we do not cover every single chapter in this guidebook, we cover the ones of most relevance to your business, which include market access for goods, rules of origin, customs administration and trade facilitation, sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barriers to trade, investment, trade and services, financial services, e-commerce, temporary entry for business persons, government procurement, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, and chapters related to inclusive trade such as labor, environment, and SMEs. Finally, although we don't have a section on dispute settlement, we do touch on this topic at several points throughout the guidebook. To find any information on any of these chapters, just take a look at the guidebook's table of contents and refer to the relevant section or subsection that is associated with that topic. The chapters within the guidebook are organized as follows: an overview of the chapter topic, a discussion of how the topic impacts Vietnam and/or why it is important, a summary of the main rules and/or objectives of the agreement chapter, and a list and description of any exceptions or extensions that have been provided to Vietnam. After the above-mentioned chapter summaries, the guidebook touches on issues of inclusive trade and how they are addressed in the full CPTPP agreement. In this section on inclusivity, the guidebook takes a look at rules and objectives related to gender equality, labor, environment, indigenous rights, and SMEs within the CPTPP. Finally, the guidebook provides training scenarios in the form of case studies, which we will discuss later on in this workshop. In addition to the summaries of the rules and objectives in each of these chapters, we have also included how-to sections with step-by-step instructions for facilitating trade and filling out documents under the CPTPP. These how-tos are found at the very end of the guidebook under the Resources section. They will be especially useful if you are unsure of how to claim preferential tariff treatment or how to proceed with other forms and documents that are part of the agreement. Our workshop today will primarily focus on these how-to sections, as they'll be most relevant to your or your client's businesses. Going back to the Resources section, the step-by-step guides that we have included tell you how to find a tariff elimination schedule, claim preferential tariff treatment, obtain an advance ruling, determine if a procurement is covered under the CPTPP, determine treatment of Vietnamese services, determine treatment of Vietnamese investment, determine temporary entry for business persons. Finally, our guidebook concludes with a list of CPTPP websites for all other CPTPP countries, as well as a list of other online resources. These will also be discussed later in the workshop. So now that we understand how to use the guide, Let's move on to walking through the guidebook's content, beginning with trade in goods and claiming preferential tariff treatment. Over to you, Olivia.
Great, thank you, Erin. Now I will discuss trade in goods for exporters and importers under the CPTPP. The CPTPP offers many benefits to Vietnamese goods exporters, with the largest benefit being the reduction in tariffs on goods that are exported to other CPTPP countries. For example, once the CPTPP entered into force in Vietnam on the 14th of January 2019, tariffs were fully eliminated on 86% of exported products between CPTPP countries. Once the CPTPP is fully implemented, tariffs will be completely eliminated on 99% of all exported products between CPTPP countries. For most countries, tariff cuts take place once a year until the CPTPP is fully implemented or tariffs are fully cut for specified products. For many goods, tariffs are fully cut immediately upon entry into force. However, it is critical to note that the reduction in tariffs does not apply automatically. In other words, if you do not claim it, you do not get it. It is the responsibility of the exporter, importer, or in some cases the producer, to ensure that the product that is exported or imported qualifies for preferential tariff treatment. In this section of the workshop, I hope to show you how to use the guidebook to claim that preferential tariff treatment. As previously mentioned, the final section of the guidebook provides several how-to or step-by-step guides, which you can see in the table of contents here. The How-to Market Access for Goods section is where you should begin when looking to claim preferential tariff treatment on a good that is being exported to another CPTPP country. Claiming preferential tariff treatment can be broken down into 4 steps. First, identify the tariff classification of your product. Second, identify the tariff rate and/or tariff rate quota that will be applied to your product. Third, determine if your product qualifies as originating from a CPTPP party. And fourth, prepare a certification of origin. Before diving into these steps, it's first necessary to differentiate between tariff rates and tariff rate quotas. A tariff rate is the rate at which you will be taxed. A tariff rate quota is based on the volume of imports. So there could be a lower tariff rate for a specific quantity of goods, but if you go above that specified quantity, then there will be a higher tariff rate. Now, let's go through each of these steps. The first, again, being identify the tariff classification of your product. Tariff classification is also referred to as an HS code, which stands for Harmonized Item Description and Coding System. This step is necessary because different tariff rates are given to different products, which means that different levels of tariff reductions apply to these different products. If you don't already know the HS code for your product, it's very easy to find. You can find your product's HS code by using a website dedicated to finding HS codes, where you can search your product's name or description of your product to find its appropriate HS code. In Vietnam, the Vietnam FTA portal can be used to find a good's HS code. The link to the trade portal is provided in the guidebook, as well as an explanation of how to utilize the portal. To access the link, you can start by typing in the link provided in the guidebook, or by going to fta.moet.gov.vn. On the homepage, you can search the name or description of your good in the HS code or keyword box. If your product is a service, make sure to first switch to the Search Services tab. As an example, let's say you plan to export live shrimp. To find the HS code for shrimp, select the Search Goods tab and then type the word shrimp into the keyboard box. Let's say we're exporting to Canada, so we can select the Exporting from the drop-down menu and then select Canada. Click Search and you'll be sent to a page that lists potential HS codes for your product. In this example, your HS code would be 030616. The HS codes found on the FTA portal are 2017 HS codes, which are the most up-to-date codes, as some 8-digit HS codes are updated only every 5 years. There are other websites that you can also use to confirm your product's HS code. Some examples are Canada Post's HS code Tariff Finder or tarifffinder.ca. When using international HS code finders, the national numbers in the tariff code may be different, but the international numbers will be the same. Here is an example of how to read an HS code. An HS code is broken into 6 categories, 3 of which are recognized internationally. The first pair of digits are for the chapter, so in this example, it's fish and crustaceans. The second pair of digits are for the heading, so here the heading would be crustaceans. The third pair are for the subheading, so here, shrimps and prawns. And then the last 3 pair of digits are subdivisions that can vary nationally. Once you've found your product's HS code or tariff classification, we can move on to step 2, identify the tariff rate and/or tariff rate quota that will be applied to your product. There are different ways to identify the tariff rate and/or tariff rate quota that will be applied to your product. The first is by taking a look at the tariff elimination schedule of the country to which you may be exporting, or if you're importing, by taking a look at Vietnam's tariff elimination schedule. To do this, let's first learn how to find and read a tariff elimination schedule. Each CPTPP country has its own tariff elimination schedule, which sets out each country's commitments to reduce tariff rates. The full list of tariff elimination schedules can be found in Annex 2D of the CPTPP agreement. Annex 2D is found in the full text document of the agreement, which can be accessed on the Vietnamese government's website, or by searching CPTPP MOIT Gov Vietnam on Google, then clicking the Agreements Documents tab, which should be the 4th tab, and then scroll down to Annex 2D and click on the tariff elimination schedule of the country you are exporting to, or for Vietnamese importers, you should click on Vietnam's tariff elimination schedule. For this example, let's take a look at Japan's tariff elimination schedule. You'll see that the schedule includes the following: the product's HS code, a description of the products that fall under each HS code, the base rate, which is the duty rate or tariff that applied prior to the CPTPP and is the starting point for tariff reductions, the staging category for tariff reductions, which is a category that tariffs will be reduced by. For example, EIF category tariffs will be eliminated immediately upon the CPTPP's entry into force. B2 tariffs will be eliminated in 2 stages over the course of 2 years. B3 tariffs will be eliminated in 3 stages over the course of 3 years, and so on. And lastly, the tariff rate that will be applied in that year. Tariff elimination schedules for every CPTPP country will all contain this information. So now that you know how to read a tariff elimination schedule, you should be able to easily find the tariff rate that will be applied to your product. But first, make sure to determine the year of tariff reductions the product is in, and then find the tariff rate for that year in the schedule. For shrimp, for example, tariffs drop to 0% immediately upon entry into force, so the tariff rate would be 0%. There are also online resources that can help to identify the tariff rate that will be applied to your product. In addition to using the Vietnam FTA portal to find an HS code, you can also use the same website to find the tariff rate applicable to your product. Vietnam's Customs Authority also provides information on the import tax that will be applied to a product. Once you know your product's HS code and the reduced tariff rate that will now be applied, you must now prove that your product originates from Vietnam or any other CPTPP country, which leads us to step 3 of this guide, determining if your product is originating based on the Rules of Origin, or ROO, requirements in Chapter 3. These rules of origin exist to ensure that products originating in CPTPP economies benefit from the tariff reductions specified in the agreement, while those products that do not originate in these countries do not receive the same benefits. Therefore, in order to benefit, you must prove that your product originates from Vietnam or from any other CPTPP country. According to the CPTPP, a product is considered to originate from a CPTPP country if it is wholly obtained from or produced in a CPTPP country. So, for example, goods that are grown, raised, caught, or extracted in a CPTPP country. So, for example, shrimp caught in Vietnam would be considered originating there. A product is also considered to originate from a CPTPP country if it is produced in a CPTPP country exclusively from inputs from one or more CPTPP countries. So, for example, if Vietnam produces cell phones with parts that it imports from other CPTPP countries, such as Japan. Finally, it can be considered to be originating if it meets the requirements of Annex 3D, Product-Specific Rules of Origin. Let's dive into what Annex 3D means. To meet the requirements of Annex 3D, Product-Specific Rules of Origin, a product must either undergo a change in tariff classification in a CPTPP country during its process of becoming a final good. So, for example, pure gold from Russia, which has an HS code of 7108, could meet the product-specific rules of origin and therefore be considered originating from a CPTPP country if it is processed in Vietnam into gold jewelry, which has an HS code of 7113. So if it changes HS codes in a CPTPP country, it can be considered originating. A product can also be classified as originating if it contains a specified quantity of regional value content, or in other words, a certain amount of value is added to the product in a CPTPP country. There are 4 main ways to calculate regional value content, which are focused value method, build down method, build up method, or the net cost method. That's for automotive goods only. The formulas for calculating regional value content using each of these 4 methods can be found in Chapter 3, Article 3.5 of the agreement. Finally, even if your product meets the above requirements, there may be other requirements that must be satisfied for a product to be considered originating from a CPTPP country. These requirements can be found in the Rules of Origin section of this guidebook and include things like shipping requirements and requirements for textiles and apparel goods, among others. Now that you know that your product originates from a CPTPP country, we can move on to our final step, which is step 4, prepare a certification of origin for your product. This certification of origin is not a pre-existing government form, but rather something you create that then, when it contains the necessary information, becomes your certification of origin. Let's go over the steps of how to create a certification of origin. A certification of origin must be prepared and submitted to the Importing Customs Authority. This can be done by the exporter, importer, or producer and is valid for a period of up to 12 months after the date it is issued, unless otherwise specified by the importing country. A certification of origin can also apply to multiple shipments of identical goods so long as all shipments are made within 12 months that it is valid. Although a certification of origin can be completed by an exporter, importer, or producer, only the importer can claim preferential tariff treatment. A certification of origin must contain the following: indication of whether the importer, exporter, or producer is completing the certification of origin, the name and contact information of the certifier, the name and contact information of the exporter, importer, and/or producer, the product's HS code and description, the origin criterion used to determine that the product is originating from a CPTPP country, the period for which the goods are certified, blanket period, and finally, an authorized signature and date. The information required for submitting a certification of origin can also be found in Chapter 3, Annex 3B. Now, if after going through all of the 4 steps above, you would like the certainty of knowing if your product qualifies for preferential tariff treatment, you can apply for what is called an advanced ruling. CPTPP parties are required to provide written advance rulings on tariff classification and origin when requested by exporters, importers, or producers. Advance rulings provide more certainty to businesses who would like to know how their product will be treated under the CPTPP. Exporters can request an advance ruling from the customs authority of the CPTPP country to which they are exporting. Your customs broker or importer in the CPTPP country may be able to assist with this process. The How to Obtain an Advance Ruling section of the guidebook provides a list of websites for all CPTPP country customs authorities. Importers can request an advance ruling from the General Department of Vietnam's Customs on customs.gov.vn. CPTPP country customs authorities are required to provide the advance ruling within 150 days of when all of the information for the request was received from the exporter. Advance rulings are valid from their issue date for a period of at least 3 years and take effect on the date of issue unless otherwise specified in the ruling. Finally, an appeal or administrative review of the advance ruling can be requested as needed. So hopefully from this section, you've learned how to claim preferential tariff treatment on goods. More specifically, I hope you'll be able to find a product's HS code, identify the tariff rate that will be applied to your product, determine if your good qualifies as originating, prepare a certification of origin, locate and read a tariff elimination schedule, and finally, request an advance ruling. Now that you know how to benefit from the CPTPP when trading goods within CPTPP countries, let's turn to Pauline to go through the steps required to benefit from the CPTPP when engaging in services trade.
Thank you, Olivia. Before we go into the specifics of how to determine treatment of Vietnamese services, let me first tell you why services trade is important to Vietnam. Vietnam's services sector accounts for about 42% of the country's overall GDP as of 2020, making it a very significant part of the economy. Just in the first quarter of 2021, Vietnam's services sector grew by about 3%, making up 36% of Vietnam's overall growth in GDP in the first quarter of 2021. Despite the strength of the domestic services sector, Vietnam has a services trade deficit of $10.3 billion as of 2020, with services exports declining at an average rate of 9.6% per year between the years of 2016 and 2020. In April of this year, Vietnam released its Strategy for the Development of the Services Sector in the Coming Years. The strategy states that with a predicted growth rate of about 7 to 8 percentage points in the next 10 years, the services sector is going to make up 50% of Vietnam's GDP in 2030 and 60% of Vietnam's GDP by 2050. It's evident that the services sector is important to Vietnam's economy. Therefore, understanding how you determine the treatment of Vietnamese services under the CPTPP is an essential part of capitalizing on the benefits of the agreement. So now, let's work through the steps of how to export services. So the first step is to identify which CPTPP market you would like to export to. The second is to make sure that your service is covered under Chapter 10, the Cross-Border Trade and Services chapter of the agreement. There are certain services that are not covered or are covered elsewhere in the agreement. Here's a list of the following services not covered under the Trade and Services chapter: financial services, government procurement, subsidies or grants provided by the CPTPP party in question, such as insurance, guarantees, and government loans, any services supplied by a government authority, most air services or services in support of air services, except for certain types of services, which are covered in this chapter, such as aircraft repair and maintenance. So once you've determined if your service is covered and does not fall into one of the above-mentioned categories, which is not covered, you can proceed to step 3, which is to figure out what type of service trade your export falls under. There are 4 different types of services trade. The first is cross-border. A consumer in the exporting country receives services from abroad, for example, telemedical advice, consultancy reports, etc. The second is consumption abroad. Either a citizen of the exporting country moves abroad to consume services, for example, as a tourist, student, patient, or a good is sent abroad to be repaired or serviced, for example, specialized equipment. The third is presence of a service supplier. A service supplier of one country establishes a presence in another country to provide a service, such as domestic subsidiaries of foreign insurance companies or hotel chains. Note that this does not cover the entry of an actual person, an actual human being, as that is covered under Chapter 12, temporary entry of business persons. And the fourth is commercial presence. Persons from one country enter another to provide a service, for example, accountants, doctors, or teachers. So all 4 of these categories are covered under the Trade and Services chapter of the agreement. After that, the next consideration is to understand the core obligations on trade and services that are outlined in the chapter. These obligations are ones that all CPTPP parties have to abide by, and they provide opportunities for Vietnamese SMEs by making trade more open, more secure, and less risky. Some of the most important rules include national treatment, most favored nation treatment, market access, local presence, domestic regulation, recognition, and finally, payments and transfers. For any questions on these obligations, please refer to the accompanying guidebook. Finally, the last step is to make sure that you're familiar with the exceptions that each CPTPP country has to the cross-border trade and services section. Each party has a list of instances where a certain core principle listed in the chapter does not apply to them. The reservations differ by party and by industry, so it's important to go through the exceptions before exporting to a CPTPP party. Reservations in the Cross-Border Trade and Services chapter can be found within the CPTPP text in Annex 1, Existing Measures, and Annex 2, Activities and Sectors Reserved for Future Flexibility. For example, one of Vietnam's reservations is that foreign services suppliers are not permitted to supply auditing services unless they meet the requirements of local presence in Vietnam. This exception means that any CPTPP party looking to supply auditing services in Vietnam cannot do so unless they have a local presence in Vietnam. So now that we've determined the steps, what does this all mean for Vietnamese exporters? Well, as mentioned, these rules create more certainty around services trade. If there's a set of rules and legal protections, there's less risk to engaging in trade. This means that the CPTPP provides new opportunities to trade in services for Vietnamese exporters, especially for exports to countries that Vietnam had not previously had FTAs with, such as Canada, Mexico, and Peru. Before the CPTPP, Vietnam had only benefited from the WTO's General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, with these countries. Now, there's improved market access for services sectors above and beyond GATS. For example, some of the sectors that Vietnamese services exporters to Canada will have improved market access in are veterinary services, environmental services, educational services, among others. Overall, I hope this has helped you understand how to determine treatment of Vietnamese services and why the CPTPP helps Vietnamese services exporters and importers. Over to you, Olivia, for the next section.
Great, thank you, Pauline. It is important to understand that in order to facilitate trade in both goods and services and to facilitate investment, the free movement of business people is crucial. This next section will outline the CPTPP's commitments for the temporary entry of business persons. This section is important because it reduces entry barriers for these business persons at the borders, in turn allowing Vietnamese companies to better service their clients abroad, manage and integrate their overseas operations, and foster business opportunities. In order to determine temporary entry for business persons, the following steps need to be taken by Vietnamese companies. First, it is necessary to determine the type of business person that applies or that best describes you or your company. Every member country has different definitions of what they consider a business person, so make sure to review your country of interest's specific definition. For example, here Vietnam's definition of different categories of business people. The service salesperson refers to the people entering the territory of another party for a short period of time to engage in non-paid business activities. Intra-corporate transferees, or ICT, refers to managers, executives, and specialists employed in an enterprise of a party who seek to provide services to the enterprise's parent company, subsidiary, or affiliate in Vietnam. Another category is persons responsible for setting up a commercial presence, which refers to managers and executives from another CPTPP economy responsible for setting up their commercial presence for a service provider in Vietnam. The category called Other Personnel includes managers, executives, and specialists employed by an enterprise from another CPTPP economy with commercial presence in Vietnam who participate in their enterprise's activities. The last category is Contractual Service Suppliers, or CSS, which include business persons who are employees of an enterprise of another CPTPP economy with no commercial presence in Vietnam and who have obtained a service contract from a Vietnamese enterprise. The further details on the categories can be found under the annexes of Chapter 12. After you've determined what category of business person you fall under, the next step is to understand what entry conditions you qualify for, specifically the limitations, length of stay, and labor mobility conditions that you are eligible for. Each country has differing eligibility conditions, so make sure to review those before sending any business persons abroad. Those conditions can be found, again, under the annexes of Chapter 12. Third, Vietnamese companies must be aware that the labor mobility conditions outlined in the CPTPP do not replace a country's regular immigration process. Vietnamese business persons will still have to satisfy the specific country's entry requirements, including visas or work permits. This information can generally be found on the country's immigration website. It is also an option for the business person or company that is seeking entry to obtain legal counsel to ensure that all of the conditions are met. The requirements of entry for business persons vary by country. For example, a service salesperson from Vietnam will be granted temporary entry under the CPTPP to Canada, but not to Mexico. Similarly, an ICT manager will be granted temporary entry to Australia, but not to Singapore. As a general rule of thumb, most temporary entry rules are reciprocal, meaning that if Canada grants entry to service salespersons from Vietnam, Vietnam will also grant entry to sales service persons to Canada. However, this rule does have exceptions, which is why it's important to review the guidebook and note the specifications for each category that each country has before sending any employees abroad. Let's move on to understand how to determine treatment of Vietnamese investment.
In addition to increased market access for the flow of goods, services, and people, an improved investment environment is another benefit of the CPTPP. Clear rules and guidelines for all direct investment between CPTPP parties are put in place to reduce risk and increase investment between the member parties. The core obligations include national treatment, which says that the CPTPP parties must treat Vietnamese investors the same way they treat their own investors. Most favored nation treatment states that there can be no preferred treatment of one CPTPP party's investors or investments over any other country's investors or investments. The next principle is minimum standard of treatment, which highlights that all parties must provide a minimum standard of treatment with regards to Vietnamese foreign investments and must comply with customary international law, which also states fair and equitable treatment and full protection and security. The principle of expropriation and compensation means no party can expropriate or nationalize a covered Vietnamese investment. If this occurs, compensation is required. The transfer principle states that all transfers of capital relating to covered investments must occur freely and without delay. The last principle is performance requirements, which states no party can impose or enforce certain requirements on investments. For example, domestic purchases of goods, mandated technology transfers, etc. Each CPTPP party has a list of exceptions it holds where some, or at times all, of the core principles I mentioned earlier do not apply. These exemptions vary by market and by sector, so it's important to become familiar with the exceptions of the market you are investing in. A full list of exceptions for each party can be found in Annex 1 and Annex 2. When conflicts regarding investments arise, they can be handled through the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which is an independent third-party arbitration process provided to CPTPP parties. Back to you, Phoebe, to talk about government procurement.
Thanks, Pauline. Government procurement refers to the purchase of goods and services made by a public authority, such as a government agency or state-owned enterprise. When it is the government purchasing a good or service, it is treated under a separate chapter in the CPTPP called government procurement. It should be noted that under the CPTPP, government procurement applies only to the national level. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, states that government procurement represents approximately 14 to 20% of most developed countries' GDP. Therefore, any improved market access to government procurement bids in other CPTPP economies can represent significant opportunities for Vietnamese businesses. The government procurement chapter within the CPTPP agreement mainly aims to address some of the barriers that firms may face when selling to foreign governments. Moreover, under the CPTPP, the key provisions that apply to government procurement are national treatment or non-discrimination, accountability, which highlights that CPTPP countries can establish an administrative or judicial authority to review challenges or complaints by suppliers, impartiality, which means all bidders are treated equally in the procurement process, transparency, meaning that the procurement process must be transparent. The most important thing for businesses to know is that there is no blanket coverage for government procurement. For example, many Vietnamese government bodies are not covered by this agreement. Similarly, not all goods and services are covered by the procurement chapter. Therefore, companies should pay attention to which government agencies, goods, and services are covered by the agreement. This information can be found under Annex 15A. To ensure that foreign companies can compete with their domestic counterparts on equal footing, the CPTPP also makes members give notice to the public of any intended procurement bids through paper or electronic means. With that in mind, how do you determine if procurement is covered under the CPTPP? First, make sure that the procuring entity is listed in the government schedule, which is Annex 15A of the target country. As mentioned, Vietnam has specific entities which are not covered by this agreement. All countries will have similar lists, so it is important to look at those entities before bidding. Next, you have to make sure that the procurement is above CPTPP thresholds. Only the government procurement contracts above the value thresholds are covered by the CPTPP. To determine the thresholds that apply to the procurement, refer to Annex 15A. It should be noted that the currency used for most CPTPP countries' thresholds is a special drawing rights, or SDRs, that is created by the International Monetary Fund. The calculation methods for conversion rates between SDR and the local currency can be found in Section H of each economy's Annex 15A. Next, each country has a specific list of goods and services that are covered. You can find these in Section D, E, and F in the country's schedule. It's important to review this list to make sure that your good or service is covered. It's also essential to pay attention to any notes in these sections that exclude specific types of procurement. Finally, it is important to determine if the procurement is excluded from coverage for any reason other than the ones mentioned above. To check if the procurement is subject to an exception or exclusion, you can refer to Section G of the country's schedule and Article 15.3. It's important to note that even if the procurement is not covered, Vietnamese clients may still be able to bid. But the key CPTPP rules, such as national treatment, accountability, and transparency, will not apply. Now, over to Erin to discuss the CPTPP's role in promoting inclusive trade.
So now that you understand government procurement, let's move on to understanding how the CPTPP promotes inclusive trade. To understand that, it's first necessary to understand what exactly inclusive trade means. Inclusive trade fundamentally tries to address two main issues that arise within international trade. The first issue is that not everyone benefits equally from international trade. Women, indigenous peoples, developing countries, and SMEs disproportionately bear the burdens of international trade and do not necessarily reap the same benefits as, say, large corporations. I should note here that the term indigenous peoples may be used in international trade agreements and international fora. Throughout this workshop and our guidebook, indigenous peoples in Vietnam will be referred to as minority ethnic groups. Now, the second issue is that international trade can have a negative impact on the environment. So inclusive trade tries to remedy these issues by creating a trade model that ensures that groups that have traditionally faced barriers to trade benefit from it, while also making sure that the environment is protected. Recognizing the importance of this, the CPTPP placed inclusive trade at its forefront. The agreement has chapters on the environment, SMEs, and labor. It also contains rules that address gender equality, indigenous rights, and corporate social responsibility. Let's delve in deeper to some of these provisions. The rules set out in the SME chapter aim to reduce the barriers that SMEs face when trying to export abroad, such as the administrative costs or lack of necessary information and resources. The labor chapter addresses inclusive trade by trying to reduce workforce discrimination, which impacts women, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, and youth. In other words, the labor chapter makes sure that participation in international trade and labor rights are not mutually exclusive. The environment chapter tries to achieve a few different things. First, it promotes adherence to international environmental laws, agreements, and treaties. Think the Paris Agreement. But it also goes above and beyond pre-existing documents and creates its own rules that focus on specific areas of environmental protection, such as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing or invasive species. Finally, while there aren't specific chapters to promote gender equality or uphold Indigenous rights, there are specific rules in the agreement that aim to do so. For example, to promote gender equality, there are rules that support women's participation in global value chains, GVCs, as well as rules that aim to improve women's access to technology, both of which can in turn facilitate trade. To uphold Indigenous rights, there are rules that are dedicated to preserving and respecting traditional knowledge, cultural practices, and expressions. Overall, the CPTPP has integrated various chapters and rules to ensure that it is promoting trade that is comprehensive and progressive, also known as inclusive trade. Next, let's hear from Pauline about some of the other chapters in the agreement.
Thank you, Erin. So now, you should be familiar with the many core elements of the CPTPP. Knowledge of trade in goods and services, temporary entry, government procurement, and the investment chapter will be beneficial when engaging in trade with other CPTPP countries. However, the CPTPP is a 30-chapter document. So I will briefly now go over the key points from the other chapters. Most notably, the intellectual property, state-owned enterprise, and e-commerce chapters, respectively. So let's take a look at some of the key points from the intellectual property chapter. So first, what is intellectual property and what are intellectual property rights? Intellectual property, or IP, is any creation of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs, symbols, names, images that are used in commerce. IP is protected by law in the form of patents, trademarks, and copyright. IP rights allow a person to receive recognition or financial benefit for their invention or creation. So what is the role of the CPTPP in upholding IP rights? Well, the objectives of the IP chapter of the CPTPP are to allow a person or company to receive financial benefit for their invention, prevent the abuse of IP rights, ensure that CPTPP countries treat IP rights of foreign nationals the same as their own, and ensure enforcement of IP rights, as well as adherence to relevant international treaties such as WIPO, the Copyright Treaty, WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty, and the Budapest Treaty. Overall, the chapter covers most areas of IP rights and protection and enforcement, which include trademarks, industrial designs, geographical indications, patents, pharmaceuticals, copyright, and trade secrets. The chapter contains specific sections and sets of rules for several of these areas. So if you have a question concerning one of these areas, it would be helpful to consult the related section. For example, Section C is dedicated to trademark rules. Section E is dedicated to rules on geographical indications. Section F for patents. Section G for industrial designs. Section H for copyright, and so on. When looking for a particular IP rule, it is also important to consult Article 1883 4F for a list of exceptions where Vietnam has been granted a transition period. To ensure that the rules surrounding IP protection measures are transparent, the IP chapter requires all CPTPP countries to make publicly available relevant laws and regulations on IP. Another highly relevant chapter is the e-commerce chapter. The e-commerce chapter is one that is important for Vietnamese businesses, given that Vietnam's e-commerce sector has experienced considerable growth from 2015 to 2020, experiencing growth of 36% over that period of time. The e-commerce chapter ensures that digital products can flow freely and do not face customs duties or other prohibitive requirements. Some key rules laid out within the e-commerce chapter include commitments to maintain laws that prevent fraud, spam, the unauthorized use of personal information in e-commerce, in order to ensure that both consumers and businesses are protected when participating in cross-border e-commerce. Another rule is to provide the same treatment to digital products from the other CPTPP countries as those received by domestic products, particularly with regards to customs duties. And the final rule is to ensure the free flow of data by not requiring data to be stored within the borders of a particular country. For Vietnamese firms, this means you can locate computing facilities at home or around the world while conducting business in the CPTPP economies. Please consult the country-specific information section of the e-commerce chapter of your guidebook, where you'll find exceptions to some of these rules. Vietnam in particular has a significant number of exceptions. Next, we will briefly go over the State-Owned Enterprise, or SOE, chapter. This chapter is particularly relevant to Vietnam compared to other CPTPP countries, given the prevalence of SOEs in the country, which accounted for 52% of the total revenue of Vietnam's 500 largest enterprises in 2017. So what type of enterprises does the SOE chapter apply to? According to the CPTPP, an SOE is defined as an enterprise that engages in commercial or business activities and where the state directly owns more than 50% of the enterprise's shares, or controls more than 50% of the voting rights, or holds power to appoint the majority of the members of the board of directors or other equivalent persons. Some examples of Vietnamese SOEs include Vietnam Oil and Gas, Vietnam Posts and Telecommunications Group, and Vietnam Railways. This chapter ensures that SOEs do not distort trade and that there is a level playing field between SOEs and private enterprises. For Vietnamese SMEs, this also means that the CPTPP ensures fair competition against SOEs in other CPTPP countries. Finally, it's worth covering the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures chapter and Technical Barriers to Trade chapter. The CPTPP and our guidebook contains chapters on each of these areas. One for sanitary and phytosanitary, or SPS measures, and one for Technical Barriers to Trade, or TBT. Briefly, to review what TBT and SPS measures are. TBT are any domestic regulations or standards that negatively affect trade. SPS measures are measures applied by governments to ensure that human, animal, and plant health is protected by reducing the spread of pests or diseases and by ensuring that our food is safe to eat. Both TBT and SPS measures can impact trade when they're being used unfairly in a manner not based on proper evidence, or with the purpose of preventing competition and distorting trade. Moreover, these measures, standards, and procedures can be time-consuming, confusing, can vary significantly between countries, which can make trading between CPTPP parties more difficult. The TBT and SPS chapters, therefore, aim to ensure transparency of regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures, to encourage the use of internationally accepted standards, and to ensure that TBT and SPS measures do not create arbitrary barriers to trade. So, as SMEs, you're not only required to comply with the rules of these chapters, but you may also find that other CPTPP countries are unfairly using TBT and SPS measures to distort trade. In this case, you may use the rules from this chapter to bring the dispute to cooperative technical consultations or to dispute settlement. The guidebook provides more information on how to proceed should this be the case. That is it for the summary of the remaining chapters. Now, in the next section of this presentation, we'll use the information covered thus far in the workshop to go through some case studies together on how to export and import. Over to you, Phoebe.
Thanks, Pauline. Now we will walk through some case scenarios that will help you understand how to take advantage of both the guidebook and the CPTPP. The guidebook contains 5 case scenarios that are designed to address various questions and situations that you or your client may encounter when engaging in international trade with other CPTPP countries. Let's take a look at one of these case studies together. You are the CEO of a textile company that manufactures women's cotton clothing called High Fashion Mode, established in 2005. Your company is very successful domestically, with 2 production facilities in Vietnam. 5 years ago, you began to export your clothing abroad. You have been focused largely on the Asian market, having exported to stores in the Philippines, Thailand, and Cambodia. 2 years ago, you began exporting to the United States, although you are still only exporting a small amount. Recently, you heard of another clothing company in Vietnam taking advantage of the CPTPP and having great success exporting to Canada. You believe your business could also see success in Canada, especially considering your experience in the United States, and you decide you would like to expand your business to the Canadian market. You want to know how to ensure your company is competitive in Canada and how to take advantage of the CPTPP's benefits. You also want to specifically understand the benefits that the CPTPP covers in Canada in comparison to the US market, and whether the benefits are significant enough that you should shift your focus entirely from the US to Canada. You also realize that there are other competing exporters from countries that have FTAs with Canada. With this, you want to understand the tariff schedule for your products and how you can benefit from the agreement's preferential treatment. Finally, you are also keen on expanding your consumer base through e-commerce as well. Due to this, you want to know more about the digital technology sector in Canada. You believe it is important for businesses to go paperless and would like to know how Canada facilitates this as a CPTPP member country. How would you proceed? Where would you get your answers? Now, take a second to pause the screen to think about how you might respond to these questions. Hopefully, you've given yourself enough time to come up with how to respond in this scenario. Now, let's take a look at some answers to this scenario. First, let's address the question of how to take advantage of the CPTPP's benefits. It is important to identify the tariff code, or HS code, that your product is classified under. To find your product's HS code, you can go to the website of the relevant customs authority. There are various online tools or websites that can help identify your HS code, as we discussed earlier. You can also seek legal counsel to ensure that you choose the right category. In this case, since your company manufactures women's cotton clothing, the universal 6-digit HS code is 620630. Next, it is important to determine how your good will be treated under the CPTPP. To do this, you have to review Canada's Tariff Elimination Schedule, which can be found under 2D, Canada General Notes to Tariff Schedule, Part 5 of the CPTPP. The schedule shows us that the base tariff rate pre-CPTPP was 17%. As of year 1, for example, the entry into force of the CPTPP for Canada, the tariffs have been completely eliminated. With this, your company would see a significant benefit in exporting to Canada under the CPTPP, as the tariffs have been reduced from 17% to 0. Now, to address the second question of whether it is more beneficial to export your product to Canada or to the United States. The United States tariff rates can be found on this website, dataweb.ucitc.gov/tariff. Using the website, it was found that your product, HS code 620630, is subject to the most favored nation, known as MFN, or normal trade relations, known as NTR, rate of 15.4%. Vietnam does not benefit from any FTA preferential tariff rate with the United States for this product. Before the CPTPP, the company would have been better off exporting to the US, with its 15.4% tariff rate compared to Canada's 17% tariff rate. Now, however, with the benefits of the CPTPP, your company is better off exporting its product to Canada with no tariff rate. Finally, to help the business owner explore Canada's e-commerce opportunities, you would look at how Canada supports digital technology as a CPTPP member. The CPTPP contains a chapter on electronic commerce, Chapter 14. The chapter contains rules and regulations meant to ensure consumer protection, facilitate cross-border e-commerce, not discriminate based on nationality or territory of production, ensure the free flow of information across borders, and more. Canada, as a member of the CPTPP, has committed to these rules, and therefore aims to create an environment of certainty for e-commerce providers. So, that is just one example of a case study. We also encourage you to look at the 4 remaining case scenarios that go along with this guidebook. You can work through these on your own by first reading the scenario, then using the guidebook to answer. You can then check your answers with the answer guide that is also included in the guidebook. You can also take a look at the online resources section at the very end of the CPTPP guidebook, which is a list of various websites that can be helpful in understanding the CPTPP. One category of websites that may be helpful is the SME sites of different governments. Canada's SME site, for example, offers information on how SMEs can take advantage of the CPTPP, which would be a helpful addition to our guidebook and to this presentation. Now that we've put our knowledge into practice, back to Pauline for some concluding remarks.
With that, we've reached the end of the workshop. Congratulations on making it through the last hour. We know it's been a lot of information to digest, but there's a lot of important content to consider in order to reap the benefits of the CPTPP. Hopefully, this guidebook in combination with the online resources will provide you with all the tools you'll need to benefit from the CPTPP when exporting to or importing from other CPTPP countries. You should now be well equipped to take on any issues that may arise in your exporting or importing journey. We hope that you'll be able to easily refer back to all the resources that we've provided you with today. Once again, thank you for participating in this workshop. We hope you found it beneficial and that you come away equipped with the knowledge of how to take advantage of all the benefits the CPTPP has to offer.